Well, in computer classes, I often ask people, what's the best command in the whole wide world? The one you wish you had in real life? And invariably, someone will answer, undo. And that's very true. We love that undo command, and we definitely have that option, plus history and revert in Photoshop. So we're going to explore those options here. Well, as I work in an image and I start doing things like get my paintbrush and make, whoop, that's not my paintbrush, here we go, get my paintbrush, and I'm going to go ahead and quickly deselect first, Control D, and I start painting things and make changes. Those commands are being recorded in Photoshop, and there's actually what's called a history panel. And the history panel is going to track what you're doing here in Photoshop, and you can actually undo these steps or step backward in history going ahead by clicking on an item. And interestingly enough, when I select something using one of these different tools, that's actually recorded in Photoshop history as well. So I can even use that to return to a previous state. And I can start going back through my history and actually just start removing all these things to the point where I even opened up the file. So this snapshot here is my original state, my original history state, and I can actually just jump back to that, or I could move in. Now, interesting too enough, when I click on an item, it actually goes all the steps within that item in that history state. So I'm not skipping around, I'm just going to a specific option in that history state. Now, in your edit menu, a lot of us are familiar with that. Let me scroll up here to the top of the edit menu. I have my undo, and that's Control Z right here, undo, and it's going to undo the last thing you did. Now, a little different feature with the undo command in Photoshop is, let me go ahead and try the Control Z. The Control Z, something, let me see if something's active in there. Let me just do it slightly different. Let me just do a quick command and you'll see it more active. So let's go there and we'll do the Control Z. And you can see how the Control Z, what it's doing is it's undoing the last step and then it's redoing the last step. And it's a toggle back and forth. And so the Control Z command, or the undo as it's officially called here, is really just going back and forth between the last state. And that can be handy when you're trying to do something like a color correction or you're making some subtle changes. You can compare it before and after. But there's actually what's called a step forward and a step backward. And this is how you can undo multiple steps using the step backward command, or if you wanted to redo multiple steps using the step forward command. And there's a nice keyboard shortcut here, Alt-Control-Z for step backwards, and then the Shift-Control-Z for step forward. Let me try the Alt-Control-Z. There we go. There we go. So let me try the Alt-Control-Z, and you can see how it's moving backwards, and I'll try the Shift-Control-Z, and you can see how it's stepping forward. And you can even see it here in the history as I'm doing my Shift-Control-Z. And if you're a keyboard person like I am, this is going to be a great option, just being able to go back. And a lot of times when you're working on those undo commands, they'll even be effective when you're inside a dialog box. So that'll even give you some options for working with the undo command. So just be aware of that. Some of these commands will also support undo. In fact, here's even a symbol for an undo. Let's go back to our history brush here. So in addition to the undo in the history, there's also a feature called Revert, and you can see the command is F12. And the Revert command, let's go ahead and just try that. The Revert command will revert back to the last time you have saved the file. So if you've never saved the file, it's going to go back to when you first opened it. If you've saved it recently, it'll go back to that point in your history. But that's a really nice feature. One thing that's also kind of interesting is that even though you reverted it, you can still go back to previous states of history because the options were not completely purged out of your system. I do have in my edit menu, if I scroll down, I do have a feature called Purge, and this is often used to keep down the file size. But one thing I could do is to purge the history, and that would remove any of these steps in there, and that would also give me a little bit more a boost of memory. Now let's explore some of the options with history itself. So here's the history panel, and one of the things I'd like to do is if I'm making changes to the history to my document, so for example, I made some selections with the wand here, and just going ahead. Let me collapse that panel there for a moment, just like clicking on it. And I'm going to make just a real quick selection, nothing too fancy, but just get in the sky. And then if I were going to go ahead and fill that with, let's say, a black fill color. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and deselect. I just Control D to deselect that. And I can see all these different steps in here. One of the things that I can do is I can actually save a snapshot of that item. And you can see here's my original, and here's my snapshot. And so this allows you to go back and forth between different states of the history. And if I click on here, it's going to remember anything that I might have. Now, you may end up losing some options. So if I go here to balloons and then I start doing some of my random painting, you can see how my history is starting over, but I can still return back to that original state. So again, that snapshot's really handy. You also have an option to open up a document from the current state. So let's go to the snapshot. And it created a new document from the state that I was in. So here's my original balloons layer, and here's the snapshot. I'm going to close that out, won't save it, and I'll go back to history. You can also change some of the settings of the history. So there's some history options in here that we could use. So for example, automatically creating a first snapshot. There's this feature called Allow Nonlinear History. This does require extra memory, but when you're using the nonlinear history, it allows you to jump back and forth between items and not necessarily remove one item at a time. So you can see how you can actually delete items because of the nonlinear history. Let me go back to history items and I'll uncheck that feature. And that would mean if I were to do one step, everything's going to be done. You can't undo a step in the middle. By default, you have 20 steps of history. That can be changed. Let's go here into Preferences, and we're going to move into File Handling. And actually, we're going to go from Preferences here we go, to Performance, Preferences to Performance. And we can see where it says History States 20. And you can up that, but just keep in mind it's going to require extra memory, graphic card memory and RAM memory. So 20 is the default, and I usually keep mine to 20, but you know, if you had some special documents, you might want to bump that up. Now, another thing you can do, let's go ahead, I'll set that back to 20, is let's go into File Handling here. And in File Handling, we have this feature called Save in Background. Again, that was Edit, Preferences, File Handling. And the Save in Background is a feature that's really handy, and partly it's due to this idea of the Mercury engine that allows us to do a lot more features. But let me go ahead and try hovering on that and see if it opens up. There we go. Allow work to continue while saving occurs in the background. What that means is that Photoshop can be making some updates or backups, and we can also do this automatically save recovery file every 10 minutes. And so if you do run out of memory, or there's a glitch and your computer closes or Photoshop closes without you expecting it, the good news is you can actually salvage your files. They're going to be there, they're going to be backed up for you, and you can return to them without losing all that work. It's still a good idea to save regularly, but it gives you some peace of mind as you're working on the file. And as Photoshop is making these backups, you can still work. You don't have to wait for it a few seconds for it to make those changes. So that's a really handy feature as well. So now what we're going to do is a pop quiz. In Photoshop, what is the keyboard shortcut to undo multiple steps with the step backward command? A, Ctrl+Z, B, Ctrl+Shift+Z, C, Ctrl+Alt+Z, D, Alt+Shift+Z. The answer is C, Control plus Alt plus Z. Well, now you have a lot of options for undoing your commands or even redoing those commands using the undo, the history, and the revert features.